Well, we've been celebrating the bravery of the women in the 50s, links to Women's Day. Democracy ushered in a new era with quotas, for instance, to ensure equality and representation in government. A lot of changes, but justice and safety remain elusive for many women in South Africa. On average, 1 in 5 older than 18 has experienced some sort of physical violence. Gender Links is an NGO that promotes gender equality and justice across various countries in the Southern African region. We're joined by the CEO, Colleen Lowe Morna, who is also the founding CEO of the SA Commission on Gender Equality. Thank you for being with us.
Thank
Colleen.
you.
So right now, women are being abused. 3 today killed. Do you think with this violence in focus, we can really look at the other issues like salaries and things, or is this so dominant? We have to start there.
I think the levels of gender violence in our society just point to this yawning gap between the rhetoric and the reality. And it has been so poignantly demonstrated this particular Women's Day that on the eve of Women's Day, we had this incident involving a deputy minister and 3 young women. It epitomizes, if you like, so many things that are still not right. Young women exercising their democratic right to have a conversation about the politics of our day, and they end up being beaten in a nightclub. It says, even in a public space like that, with people in positions of responsibility, as a woman, you are not safe. And that's the nub of the issue.
Nduduzi Manana, I'm glad you brought him up because President Jacob Zuma earlier did not mention his name, but in the main event said nobody is above the law. We should look at arrests for domestic violence, for gender-based violence, but he hasn't suspended him.
Exactly, and thank you for raising that, because we keep looking to these legal solutions, the courts, the police. Yes, of course they have a critical role and nobody's above the law, and it's good that the president has said that. But for someone in public office, I think there is a higher level, a higher standard that those sorts of people need to answer to. It would be normal in a mature democracy for someone who has done something like that to resign immediately, at least until he's cleared of the charges, or if not for him to resign, to be relieved of his duties. Because ministers sign an oath, they sign a pledge, they take an oath of allegiance to the Constitution. And one of the cornerstones of our Constitution is equality, and gender equality is absolutely integral to that. Now, he has not denied the fact that he behaved in the way that he did. The fact that he's apologized is already, confirming that he did behave in that way. And that someone like that remains in public office, regardless what happens with the law, I think is appalling.
You are concerned about patriarchy and this issue in the highest echelons. People have raised concern about how even female ministers rally around the president sometimes when gender issues are in focus. So we have these incredible quotas, we have a whole lot of female ministers, but are you worried about how things are playing out, sort of the rules of the game that we're witnessing there?
That's also a really important point that you've raised, and we've said it so often that we have to go beyond the numbers. It's not just about getting women in positions of authority. That's very important. Obviously, women have an equal right to be there, and that's been a major achievement in South Africa, and we can't run away from it. But beyond that, especially as we look to an election in 2019, we need to be looking at issues, whether they're women or men. What are they doing to advance what I believe is the last major frontier, the biggest revolution of our time, which is equality between women and men? Because you are so right that patriarchy is not just about the way men think, it's also about the way that women are conditioned to think. And very often when women are in those positions of authority, they are simply reflecting the positions taken by powerful people and having to defend them, even in indefensible situations.
How do you deal with it? I mean, this is ingrained in society. We're not just talking about more arrests, better protection for women. How do you deal with something this big?
You know, one of the things we do as Gender Links is we do a lot of attitude surveys. So we look at what is really driving these patriarchal norms in our society. Why is gender violence so normalized that we don't even, you know, something happens, it erupts, we all get upset, and then business as usual, we move on. And what we find is that a very high proportion of women and men in this country will say that women and men are equal. We've all heard that, we've ticked that box. But you ask a different question, like, you know, should a woman obey her husband? Does a man have a right to beat his wife? And you'll find a very high proportion of both women and men also say yes. So we're living this kind of schizophrenic existence where we have the formal laws and constitutions and provisions, but where our thinking and our attitudes has not caught up with that yet. So what I'm leading up to saying is that there are no simple tick the box kinds of solutions. We have to start at root in our homes with the way that we socialize boys and girls, in our schools, in our churches, in our communities. It's an issue that requires all sorts of different interventions at all kinds of levels, beginning actually in the home.
Is anything being done at school? Because I'm thinking at least if you get children from homes where there are not good role models, at least they can hear a different message. Do you think much is being done there?
I don't think enough is being done, because unfortunately the very gender violence that we see played out in the public spaces is also very prevalent in our schools. There are high levels of gender violence in schools. And there's been a lot of research around that. By the way, violence that not only affects girls but also boys. If you look at the levels of bullying, for example, which are very normalized and which inculcate in young men the idea that violence, you know, is the way to express power, to solve problems, and so forth. There's still a huge amount that we need to do in our education system, even in the content, in the curriculum, in challenging gender stereotypes at that level. As I say, there are no shortcuts. We have to be approaching the issue at all these different levels.
Well, one thing you're interested as an ex-journalist in is the media as well, and how gender plays out. What are you noticing, and what could we do, in fact?
You know, the progress in the media has been very slow in terms of the numbers. We have just recently done some media monitoring that tells us that here in South Africa, for example, women constitute a mere 20% of those whose views and voices are heard in the media. Women are 51% of the population, but only 20% of those whose views and voices are heard. Of course, Women's Day comes around, 16 days of activism. We get our little, you know, moment to say something. But it is about how we begin to hear women, like those young women who were beaten up in the nightclub, views and voices about every issue of the day, succession, the budget, the economy, you know, the transport, all the different things. Sports, thank you. In fact, sports is a wonderful way for us to begin to challenge it. How many women's sports do we see, first of all, being given the same kind of attention as men's sports? How many women sports presenters do we have out there? You know, these areas are still very, very male-dominated, and they haven't been presented yet in a way that says to us that women and men are participating equally in all these areas. So I think there's definitely been a lot of improvement in the media, particularly, you know, the public broadcaster has made a big effort to get women into decision-making positions and to introduce programming that is more responsive to the interests of women and men. But we still have a long way to go.
Do you believe in the quota system, really? We're seeing it used in governance. As the media, we often talk about this. How much diversity should we push? Should we say on any issue, we will speak to women, men, black, white, and really push numbers so that people are confronted by different views? But you also don't want to be patronized as a woman.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Obviously, there are many who argue against quotas. I argue for them for a very simple reason, that until you have women there, you can't begin to bring about the changes that we want to see. So access, women accessing public spaces, the media, etc., is very, very key. And so it is a very important beginning point, but it's not enough. As we have said with women in politics, we can have women in cabinet, we can have women in parliament and local government. It does not necessarily mean that that translates into gender equality for the broad mass of the people, because it is about what issues they take up and how they use those spaces to be able to bring about change. So access is an important beginning, but making sure that women participate effectively, that their views and voices are heard, and then that they use those spaces to bring about the change and the transformation that we seek. So, as again, it's not a simple win.
Finally, men, I think, are feeling unsettled. And if that patriarchy runs deep, then they would be. But we saw a while ago that campaign, Men Are Trash. And I know good men who were upset. Thuli Madonsela saying yesterday, we should learn to speak about these issues without it being a win-lose situation. Do you agree with that? And how do we approach it to get men involved rather than their backs up?
Yeah, I think that one has to understand where the Men Are Trash campaign is coming from. It's coming from a place of anger. And I think that anger is understandable, and it's a very necessary part of change. So the fact that women are angry, what sparked that? It was this particular case and several others of femicide, the horrific stories, which, if you like, are the most graphic, reminder of those inequalities that exist in our society. Women are angry, and they're entitled to be angry. But it's how we manage that anger that is important. We look at a country that has come from, incredible inequalities, and we know that it was that anger that drove the change. It was necessary. But then we have to channel it in various ways. And I think what is interesting in the Men Are Trash campaign is that there was a response to that. Social media, of course, playing a huge role now in terms of mobilizing and giving women a space to express themselves that they didn't have before. If they're not finding it in the mainstream media, they're finding that space now in new media. So it's given women a voice that we hadn't heard before, and that's why we're hearing that anger. Men responded with the Not In My Name. And those men, the Not In My Name campaign, who felt that they were being tarred with one brush and they didn't belong in that camp, stood up and we heard their voice, and they marched in Pretoria. To me, that was what was very interesting about that, because it said that 5 in 6 men are not abusers, and that's true. But where are those 5 men? We need to see them walking the talk and refusing to be identified in that way, and standing up and saying, I have a son, I have a brother, I have an uncle, I have a father, I have a grandfather, I'm going to make sure that within my circle, that's how we're finally going to bring about the change that we need, is through those men standing up.
Thank you so much for your insight this evening. That was CEO of Gender Links, Colleen Lowe Morna, in studio with us. We take a short break.